Okay, welcome. Today's lecture is going to be on magic, mystery, and philosophy, the hidden traditions. And it's very common for the history of philosophy to have a certain trajectory, where you sort of start with the pre-Socratics, work your way through the rationalism of Plato and Aristotle, jump ahead to the more rational figures of the medieval period like Augustine and Aquinas, and then you're into the modern period, and you're often running with the debate between empiricism and rationalism, and the Kantian synthesis, 19th century romanticism, 20th century positivism. You get the picture. That's fine. However, there is, in fact, another tradition that's happening in parallel to this sort of official academic history of philosophy, and it's really the hermetic or esoteric tradition. And it gets marginalized as, I think a lot of philosophers think of it as the kind of thing you would study in a history of religion course or in a cultural history course. But in truth, the hermetic or esoteric tradition was interwoven very deeply with the more rational trajectory of philosophy that I just sketched. So it was very common for philosophers and scientists. We didn't even have this distinction until the modern period, but it was very common for practitioners of science as we know it, people like Newton, to also be practicing alchemy. And it wasn't like their real job was physics and alchemy was just the side gig. They really were quite combined if you look at the historical sources on this. So it's important, I think, for people who are interested in the development of science to look at the history of science, to really understand how it was so deeply intertwined with some of these more magical traditions. And the same is true of philosophy. So I want to give a tour here of this esoteric tradition, and you'll recognize some things because some of this stuff has made its way into popular culture through certain kinds of novels, certain kinds of films, movies, Hollywood films about Satanism or various sort of magical rites. And some of that stuff is kind of ridiculous and totally disconnected, but some of it actually is connected to the imagery and some of the ideas that really were in play during the ancient, medieval, and even the modern period. So I thought this would be kind of a fun lecture to give you a better sense of what was happening and how these ideas developed. And there's a lot of visuals in this lecture, some wonderful imagery that I was able to find, and a lot of material, so I'm going to go kind of rapidly, I hope, anyway. All right, let's look at one of the founding figures and ideas in the hermetic or magical tradition, and that is Hermes Tresmegistus, which really translates as the thrice great Hermes. Hermes is not just doubly great, he's triply great. And this is the patriarch of mysticism and alchemy. And the actual character was believed to have existed. The ancients thought that this was a real person, and even the medievals did. But by the time of the Renaissance, we get a better picture that this character was probably a fabrication. Greek colonists in Egypt mixed their god Hermes, or Mercury, with the local god Thoth, and both gods were psychopomps. And they came together in this figure of Hermes Tresmegistus, who was a powerful sorcerer of some kind. To call someone a psychopomp is to refer to this ability that some characters from mythology and just religion have, which is they are able to take your soul from the living world to the afterlife. So I think Charon might be one of the most famous, the boatman who takes, you leave coins on your eyes, and this character basically has to get paid to take you across the river Styx, fairly well known. But that's just one example of a psychopomp. mythological world is filled with these characters, and they're oftentimes taking. I'm trying to think of what's the one that I'm blanking on this at the moment. But in any case, look up the psychopomps and you'll find wonderful examples of characters that are taking you from this life to the next. And the idea that this god or man god, Hermes Tresmegistus, is a psychopomp shows you that right from the beginning, he's a kind of mediator, and that magic is a kind of mediation between the seen world and the unseen world. And this turns out to be a huge theme throughout the development of the esoteric philosophy. So Hermetica is also sort of charged or energized by some fairly common imagery. And we're going to look at some of that imagery throughout this talk, but also some important texts. The texts first existed in the ancient world and then were taken up again during the Renaissance period. Some of them actually originated in the Renaissance and were basically imagined to have some much older sort of pedigree. But the Asclepius and the Corpus Hermeticum are the most important of the Hermetica, and these are the writings ascribed to Hermes Trismegistus. So you can actually still read this. There are some wonderful translations, and there have been some recent excellent translations of this work by contemporary scholars of magic, and it's the real stuff. That there were sort of Greek and Latin versions of this, and then there were Arabic versions of this, and then they came back retranslated into from the Arabic into Latin and found their way into the modern world via these sort of trajectories. In the Renaissance, scholars thought Hermetica dated back to the time of Moses, but the movement probably only goes back to the 2nd or 3rd century AD. So, even as late as the Renaissance, it was thought to be real and ancient. It was a mix of Platonism, Stoicism, Jewish and Persian influences. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but it was an attempt to create a kind of universal knowledge. The Platonic tradition and the Jewish tradition, the rationalism of Athens and the sort of religious tradition of the Abrahamic texts are oftentimes not in competition, but in tension with each other. And you'll find in the Hermetic tradition that there were many ways in which people were trying to build a kind of interfaith philosophy using the best of all these different traditions to sort of help us understand nature and help us understand each other better. So it was very ecumenical in its approach, and as a result of this, it was attractive to intellectuals, but it was also considered hostile. It was treated with hostility by some of the official dogmatic religions. So you'll see, for example, in the development of the Roman Catholic Church, increasingly there was hostility towards Hermetic traditions as a competitor with Catholicism. And the same was true in sort of mainstream branches of Judaism and certainly in Islam, as we'll see. All right. One of the crucial texts is the Emerald Tablet. And this, we think, was written between the 6th and the 8th century AD. And it's basically it's a short little text. It's purported to contain the secret of the prima materia and its transmutation. And this was the founding idea in alchemy. So many people have heard the word alchemy, which is derived from Arabic, but they're not so familiar with what the goals and the purposes of alchemy were. The belief was that this reference to the prima materia is kind of a reference to an Aristotelian idea, which was that if you look at the natural world, you can break it down into these 4 elements. And this is fairly common, not just in the West, in terms of Aristotelian thinking, but also in Chinese philosophy, for example, too. It was common to think of the world comprised of earth, air, fire, and water. And these 4 material elements, sometimes there would be a 5th element, called pneuma or pneuma, which was kind of a spiritual element that the supra-lunar heavens would be thought to be made of. This was a kind of spiritual ether that also had a material, way of mixing with elements and made up things like the sun and the planets and the stars. And in certain philosophies, it was thought that you and I, as human beings, also had some bit of this fifth element or pneuma within us. It kind of the breath of life was the idea. But in any case, the early chemical or chemistry view was that these four elements can be themselves changed by various processes. Like so if you boil water, for example, what happens to it? Water, you can watch water actually becoming steam and becoming sort of like air. And so too, you can freeze water and turn it into something that's more like earth because it becomes solid. So these transformations, Aristotle thought, required something that was continuous underneath them. But this was something that could not be perceived directly. It was not available to our perceptions. And this was the notion that he called this the prime matter. And the idea of the alchemists centuries later was that if you could figure out the way to get access to this prime matter, you could turn, simple materials, simple metals, wood, the kind of nature that we can see, you could turn it into something like gold. You could transform it. And you'd have power over nature in a way that the average schlub would not have, and even the average, naturalist or philosopher of nature would not possess. So this becomes a kind of ideal secret knowledge that people start to go after. And from this text, the Emerald Tablet, comes this very famous quote, the below is as the above, and the above as the below, to perfect the wonders of the one. So below as above, so above as below. And here the idea was that there's some kind of correlation between what's happening in this world and what's happening in the unseen or hidden world. And that if we could understand the connecting chains properly, we would have tremendous power and access to the divine realm as well. And the one here that's referred to is a notion, you could relate it to the Abrahamic traditions of monotheism, but it really comes more out of the Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition of Gnosticism, which is that there's one ultimate unconditional reality, which we could call God, and that all of reality flows from that. So the idea here is that you can be connected in some way to this one unconditioned, transcendent reality. Here's another quote from the Emerald Tablet. Separate the earth from the fire and the subtle from the gross, cautiously and judiciously. And here is basically a recommendation that if you can experiment on earth and fire and the other elements, and also separate the subtle from the gross here, meaning the fine from the raw, crude, large-scale reality. In other words, if you could sift out the smaller microstructures from earth, air, metal, then you're going to be able to get some very important ingredients that you can manipulate. So this is sort of the reigning goal or objective in early alchemy. Here then is sort of a wonderful image that shows you this idea of a philosophy of emanation, where reality is structured in this hierarchical way. At the very top, let's look at the image on the left here is just a wonderful etching that shows you, it's just chock full of these wonderful images, sort of pyramids and astrological signs and mixed with angels and scientists down below, and God knows what else is going on here, but it's just a wonderful image of how everything was thought to be interconnected and interwoven. And it's the idea of the microcosm and macrocosm connection. But I want us to focus for the moment on the image on the right, because it gives us a more sequential sense of what's happening metaphysically. If you look at the top, the alchemist and the Gnostic believer held that there was an absolute reality at the top, and then let's look at the left-hand side of that sort of set of circles. It emanates down and creates a noetic reality, which is a kind of sort of the ideals or the forms or ideas that Plato talked about. These are ideas like the truth, beauty, goodness, justice, perhaps the truths of mathematics, eternal ideas in a sense. Then this emanates further down and creates psychic reality, which is something that we can actually have some relationship to. This is the realm of thinking, mentation, the mind generally, not so much as a independent metaphysical reality, but as something that is in part psychological. And lastly, this emanates to the physical reality, the world of chairs and dogs and the flesh. So it's counterintuitive for the modern mind to think in this way, but it's very common for the ancient mind to think that the most real stuff is made of ideas, and that the physical world is this sort of changing mess of generation and corruption. It's constantly being created, growing old, breaking apart, dismantling. So it doesn't have the sort of eternal fixed status that something like 2 + 2 is 4 has, or the idea of justice. These, for the ancient mind and for the magic thinker, are more real than the physical world. So if you can get access to these and manipulate them in some way, you have power over the physical world. This is rather different. It's sort of the upside down vision that we might have in modern science, which says instead that the physical world is first and metaphysically sort of primordial, and slowly through the course of evolution you get the rise of what we might call mind. And mind is just a way of navigating through physical world, and psychology and the realm of ideas are in some sense derivative from the processes of the brain. So if you turn that view on upside down, you get something like this esoteric metaphysics. Now, this led to the development of the secret societies, and this is something people are endlessly fascinated by, and why shouldn't they be? But it's generally the idea of a cognoscenti, people who have a secret knowledge. These people don't just know a lot, they know this whole realm of hermetic or secret wisdom, which allows them to sort of enact magic through the world. And everybody loves the cognoscenti. I mean, it's a very attractive idea. I don't care if you're living in the medieval world or if you're living in the contemporary world. The idea that you're in an elite club and nobody else is in it, or very few people are in it, and this makes you more elevated than others. It's absolutely it's just an incredibly tempting sort of approach to life. And so you see it in politics, you see it in even today in the sciences, you see it in secret societies and these kind of elite moves nowadays too. But let's look at sort of this as a historical phenomenon. You'll see that in some of the early modern and Renaissance texts, like the Rosarium Philosophorum of the 16th century, they'll explicitly say something like, quote, "Whenever we have spoken openly, we have actually said nothing. But where we have written something in code and in pictures, we have concealed the truth," end quote. This is a very important line, because it tells you that it's part of the hermetic or magic tradition to be communicating not through official, books or scriptures or, encyclicals, but rather to be communicating through imagery and secret texts that need to be decoded. So here's a wonderful image that comes from this hermetic tradition, and you see a whole lot of stuff going on here. This guy has what looks like a crow on his head. It's a little hard to make out. We've got a lobster also coming in there on the top. Another bird. I don't know if that's a dove. I can't say exactly. We've got a guy with wings and what looks like a fish that seems plunged up his nether regions. Not sure what's happening there. Standing on what looks to be the moon. Well, it's suffice to say that I don't know what's happening here, but someone initiated in the Hermetic tradition would have known what was happening here. We're going to look at some animal symbols here in a moment, so I do know some of this material, but some of it, the meaning of it is just lost to us, and because it's a secret society, it was not officially recorded. There are some images here that get replicated frequently in later Hermetic traditions, the lobster being one of them, the winged humanoid, human person also. The sun is frequently characterized together with the moon, and I don't, is that a dog down there or is that a goat of some kind? I can't make it out, but in any case, it would have been readable to the Cognoscenti of this tradition, and we are, many of us are basically going to remain outsiders. Here's an image that I think many people will recognize, and so some of these have made their way into, as I say, popular culture. The Caduceus is associated with prime matter. I was sketching that earlier. The two serpents here threaded in opposite directions around the magic wand represent the primal chaos, in that the serpents are thought to be fighting. Eventually, their wrapping around the Caduceus brings about equilibrium of opposing factors, qualities, or tendencies. And this is why sometimes the Caduceus is called the symbol of peace. Besides being the messenger of the gods, Hermes, who the Caduceus is associated with, Hermes also guided humans through their changes of being. So again, as he was himself a psychopomp. This is an image that sometimes gets confused with the Asclepius, which is a single snake wrapped around a staff. But the point here I want to stress is that it was common for the Hermetic esoteric tradition to celebrate opposition. So you frequently will see in the Eastern tradition, in traditional Chinese philosophies, there's the yin-yang symbol that, many people are familiar with, the circle with the sort of interpenetrating opposites. A lot of people have it tattooed on them. This notion that within each reality is its own opposite, and that they are in some kind of tension, and sometimes it's conflict and sometimes it's harmony, is an idea that has a long history in the West, and it's very common in this magic tradition that I'm describing. So it was common for people to look at things that were traditionally in opposition and try to see them as really part of a larger organic whole. You'll see in a moment here, we'll look at this. They were very interested in androgyny, something where masculinity and femininity are basically together or mixed or in a sort of coherent relation with each other. Night and day, the sun, the moon, the microcosm, the macrocosm. So the relationship between opposition and looking for a way to synthesize them is a common theme in the Hermetic tradition. Now, here's a set of images that are important because you can see here, these are some, I'm sort of trying to deliver on this idea that nature is coded and you need to understand the secret language of nature. And so these are images from early natural history. It was very common in the medieval period to think that animals were not just interesting as in the provenance of biology or life science, but rather they were interesting from a spiritual point of view and from the point of view of morality. So it was common to think that their animals are messages from God, that they are omens, that they need to be decoded. If you look at the top image here, you'll see what is actually a bird, a mother bird pecking its own chest, so that blood is forming there, and this is feeding its own baby birds here on its own blood for nourishment. This was a very common theme in the medieval and the Renaissance period. Certain birds were thought to do this. the pelican actually was thought to do this in the Renaissance period. It was a symbol of the way in which nature, a mother, could enact motherly love, great self-sacrifice, great altruism for its beloved children. And this was also, of course, an allegory for how Jesus sacrificed himself for his beloved, children. And so nature was itself a kind of allegory of Christianity, if you're working within the Christian tradition. But look, Jewish Hermetic tradition did the same thing, and later the sort of mix-up of pagan and Abrahamic traditions that we find in the Renaissance did the same thing. So you need to think about nature as a set of coded moral lessons and spiritual lessons. It was commonly felt that there were sort of veiled references to unicorns in the Bible, and they sort of emerged in the medieval period and up into the Renaissance as being it was believed that it was a real animal. And so one frequently in the early curiosity cabinets would have a kind of a unicorn horn, that you would display to your friends and show you, look, I've got a unicorn's horn, and everyone would be, stunned and impressed by this. Of course, frequently what it was a narwhal's, horn, which is that cetacean or a whale that we know has one long horn at the front of their head. But nonetheless, it was put within the context of this morality tale that, in a way, the unicorn was a perfected animal, very hard to find and rare, and was himself a symbol of Jesus in the Christian tradition. So too, it was thought that nature was filled with things like mermaids, mermen, merpeople. And in the early natural history catalogs, people like Conrad Gesner, Athanasius Kircher, Albertus Seba, these people would have mythological creatures together with real natural history because they did not recognize any difference between the real natural history zoology and these fantastical creatures. These were all considered to be legitimate parts of nature, and it was a different way of seeing nature as, coded with deeper meanings. All right, so here then is another image which you might recognize, which is, if nature is encoded with these meanings, then so is your own body. Your form is a sort of microcosm of the macrocosm. And every place on the body was thought to be a representation, not just have a sort of correlation with an animal, but also that animal and that correlation was also correlated with an astrological reality. So you'd see that, I think in this image, if I can make this out, it's a little hard for me to see. You've got astrological symbols associated with parts on the body, and the way in which you would relate to this is, if you were sick or ill, it was very common for the medicine practitioner, whether it's one of these barbers who bleeds you or some herbalist, they would try to address, what part of the body is causing the trouble, and then what herbs or what kind of bloodletting, would be best to actually help free or release the sort of clog of the humors, and this would basically restore the harmony that you need for health. So this is, a notion that's come back strong, I think, in the West in the form of the New Age movement, which got going again in the 70s and 80s and continues now with what's sometimes called alternative medicine. When I was living in China, I went and I tried a variety of different, what's called traditional Chinese medicine methods, TCM. And this includes things that many of you have tried, which is like acupressure, acupuncture, various forms of tea, herbal remedies. And I remember when I went to the hospital I was in Shanghai. I went to the hospital and I was having back trouble. My back was giving me pain, and I went for acupuncture. The first thing I thought the doctor was going to say, well, let me look at your back, or let's talk about your back. When is this an issue for you? And the first thing he said to me was, stick out your tongue. And he was studying my tongue, and he said, oh yeah, this is a problem with your kidneys, and so we're gonna. And he put a whole bunch of needles in my back, and he had these little cups, and he would heat the cup up, and then that would put that on my back, and that would suck it would basically create a kind of suction, and the idea was that it would pull impurities out of the body. So this way of thinking of the body as a system of harmonious ingredients, and for the Chinese, the language here is qi energy. So there are these meridians in the body, and if you're ill, the idea is that the qi energy is not flowing in the proper way. And so the doctor's job is to sort of open and rearrange and to facilitate the meridian patterns so that the qi will flow better. This is part of this model of thinking I'm describing. I'm calling it hermetic or esoteric, and it has permutations in the West and the East. It's a way of thinking of the body as a symbol system that's coded, that allows you, if you're initiated into this, as a Cognoscenti, to enter in and manipulate it so that you can have access to these hidden forces. All right, so in essence, the way I describe this is simply that everything is something else. I think this is the best way to describe this way of thinking. And let's break this down further. What does this mean exactly? Well, intuitive insight is prized. And this is a way of thinking that is synthetic and creative. It's prized over the discursive deduction or analytic and destructive thinking. So if you think about Western science, what it does is it takes a phenomenon and it basically breaks it down into its constituent parts, tries to understand how those parts relate to each other, and as a methodology, it's phenomenally good. It really helps us understand nature. It is, there's just nothing like science. If you really want to understand and manipulate nature, do science. But it is an analytic method. And we need to understand that the Hermetic tradition is sort of opposite to this. It's synthetic and creative. It's not looking to break things down in the same way and see how the parts relate to each other. It's looking to break things down and see what the hidden metaphysical sources are within. So it does want to break things down, and we'll see this with alchemy here in a moment, but it thinks that there are metaphysical spiritual agencies hidden within the physical agencies as well. So there are some aspects that are similar, like in many ways, alchemy attempting to sort of boil various substances and chop up various things and submit things to pressure is the thing that led to what we now call chemistry. So it's not like there's a complete tension here, but there is a difference. The idea was that if you could make something like an image that had the right organization of symbols or icons, you could use this to control nature. That's something that you wouldn't find in science per se, but you do find it in the Hermetic tradition. Then this sort of reveals that the imagination creates knowledge. And the idea here is that when you're doing imaginative work, like creating a totem of some kind or an effigy of some kind, it will actually have some kind of influence on the real world. This is why you know this tradition of making a voodoo doll, but it really has if you think about the voodoo tradition, let's say, that comes, in New Orleans, which is a wonderful mix of African, Caribbean, Catholic traditions, it really is part of this Hermetic tradition that goes back to the ancient world, which was if you could make a small effigy of your enemy, you could in fact torture that little effigy, and it would have an associational correlation with the body of your enemy, so that you could actually make them sick in this way. And I remember when I was living in Cambodia, there was an interesting case where this happened, where this guy was murdered, and when they asked the family down the street, the guy who murdered the murderer, why did you murder this guy? He said, well, he has always hated our family, and he's made a magical cow in his house, and he's using the magical cow he's sort of torturing the magical cow to cause my mother to be sick. And so he thought this guy was using sort of black magic against his family, and that's why he murdered him. So again, this way of thinking of the world as magical, we're familiar with it. But I'm trying to show you that below this common phenomenon of supernaturalism is this strange hermetic logic of microcosm, macrocosm, of associational causation rather than just physical causation. And then here, the third point I'm making here is that thought pictures are ways to reach upward from the senses to the intellect. So the idea here is that in the Hermetic tradition, images are way more powerful than in the secular or the sort of mainstream religious tradition. In that tradition, images are just pictures, so they're copies of things. But in the magic tradition, images actually have power because the artist is, by using the imagination to create an artwork or an image, you are in a way replicating God's creativity. So this is our way to be gods, is to create. So artistic creativity is not just copying nature, it's in a way reenacting the divine creation. And finally, images are powerful ways of manipulating reality. They can contain spiritual energies that affect people and things. And that is precisely why there was a huge backlash against imagery and icons. So if you look at the development of monotheism in the Abrahamic traditions, you'll find that there was a kind of fear or sort of rejection of imagery. You might remember that in the story, Moses comes down from the mountain with the Ten Commandments and finds people sort of worshiping graven imagery. And that sort of might go right past you, and you think, oh, well, they're just worshiping, these other gods. And it's definitely the case that, Judaism is the story of the development of monotheism against what it saw as competitor gods and spiritual agencies. So there was a strong notion of heresy, which was you've got to stay with Yahweh and not worship these other things. But what might go past you is the fact that it's a graven image. In other words, the way in which pagans oftentimes related to their gods was by creating some kind of image, whether it's a little figurine, a statue. Basically, you could carve into, you could basically create these bas reliefs, which are sort of like very thin kind of sculptures that look more like images. You can basically use a sharp tool to engrave into various substrates. These were all considered to be, as monotheism got going, these were considered to be forbidden because they were ways in which people could worship other gods and they believed, acquire magical powers over others. So it was considered basically forbidden, forms of magical paganism to engage with imagery in this way. So the opposition to the use of any icon or image to represent ideas of reverence or worship is called anti-iconism. And iconism, is basically it's the negation of iconism. And it was very common. The destruction of idols and images as icons of veneration is called iconoclasm. And we use this word now symbolically, but its literal meaning was you need to go and destroy the imagery of your competing religions. And of course, Islam might be the most vigilant and hostile of the Abrahamic traditions to imagery and visual representation of God or Muhammad. It basically says you cannot represent these things. And it's no accident then that the aesthetic that emerges in the Arabic world, in the Muslim world, is this beautiful design work, which is not directly drawing, a humanoid Muhammad, but rather these beautiful arabesque lines that are designed to help us understand, transcendent mindset, or the interwoven, connection of microcosm and macrocosm. But there was this sort of critique of imagery that was very common, and basically the magical tradition was having none of it. The Hermetic magical tradition just carried on making imagery, and they oftentimes had to do it in secret, and they usually had these objects and these images that would have to be held in secret. And there are traditions of iconography that were validated by mainstream religion. One thinks about the Greek and Russian Orthodox tradition of iconography, which is a way in which mainstream religion did not become totally hostile to images and the power of imagery. But basically there was a way of synthesizing Christianity and the belief in sort of magical imagery. But here, let's look at some images that emerge in sort of Renaissance and early modern secret societies. And here we see a very famous image, Baphomet, which we think is just a corruption of the word Muhammad. So there is an interesting story here about the etymology of Baphomet, which is this goat-type demon creature. And I just don't have time to go into it right now, but suffice it to say that this emerged in the Christian world in the Renaissance period, and again in the sort of 19th century. This particular image is a very famous 19th century image of the Sabbatic goat created by Eliphas Levi in the 19th century. If you look at this carefully, many people are familiar with this image because it's also on tarot cards frequently. There's actually a wonderful legal dispute happening. I can't remember where this is, if it's Kentucky, somewhere down south, where the sort of right-wing Christian community there wanted to put a Ten Commandments on, at the federal or the government buildings there, and people objected that it was a violation of church and state, and so I think the Church of Satan went down there and said, well, look, if you can put religion on government grounds, we've got this huge sculpture of Baphomet, which we want to put on the lawn of the state building as well. And so that created a huge legal contest, but it was a kind of a funny test of the separation of church and state. And this image comes up in a lot of movies. You'll see it frequently in pop culture and in television. If you look at it more closely, you'll see that the arms have the Latin words salve on the sort of left-hand side, pointing upward, and the coagula on the right-hand side. And salve here means to separate. We get dissolve from this word, and coagulation means join together. And so again, you have this notion of a power of binding and loosing, usurped from God and acting as God's representative on earth. So this is sometimes treated as a way of saying if you look at it in a sort of negative, hostile view to mainstream religion, it's basically saying we've got these powers now, not your monotheistic God. But really, I think the deeper meaning is just that old interpenetration of opposites that we saw even in the pagan forms of Hermetic tradition, where night and day, as you see here, are always in relation with each other. You see this as an androgyne. It's a mix of feminine sexual phenotypes and masculine. You've got this phallic caduceus here rising up from the groin of the creature. You've got the pentagram. You've got the feminine breasts. It's just a wonderfully interesting image. I suppose I should make mention here of the most striking feature, which is the goat head. It is very common for this to be taken as a symbol of Satan and satanic ideas, and that is not. It's one of those images that's so replicated through our culture that it's hard to know why the goat was associated with Satan. I will tell you that one way to think about it is if you go back to those early symbolic interpretations of animals that I showed you, where this was very common in the early bestiaries, sort of collections of animals, and the physiologus, which was a collection of beasts and their symbolic meaning in the early, like from the 5th century. In there, the goat was oftentimes represented as the most sexually active animal. So goats were oftentimes thought to be really horny. They just could not get enough sex, and they were basically willing to jump on anything and try to mate with it. I mean, I think this is a fantastical view. People weren't that interested in getting the natural history, the zoology correct. They weren't animal ethologists. They just sort of had these legends about goats and whales and birds, and they, it basically just took on a life of its own by folklore. So the idea was that the goat would be something that would represent sexual licentious, a lack of discipline and control, and basically erotic drive gone wild. So you can see that it would be something that would be hostile to mainstream religious sexual decorum and the sort of social conservatism of mainstream religions. So it would be demonized, in a sense, in nature. And if you're looking for some kind of symbolic representation of hedonism and sexual, a lack of discipline, then what better than the goat? And you see this over and over again as the symbols of Satanism get more and more articulated in the 19th and 20th century. They are born out of this longer, more ancient Hermetic tradition that I've been talking about. There's a wonderful film, I think many people are fans of horror, called The Witch, that came out a few years ago, and in it there's a very mischievous goat, and so the association there with Satan continues and witchcraft. So I'm just trying to give you a sense of the longer history of this stuff. Now, let's look at the pagan elements then. How did this imagery get taken up and turned into a fairly common trope for Satanism? The Knights Templar is a secret society that many people have heard of, and you see this stuff cropping up in the kind of novels by Dan Brown and so forth, and some of or like Umberto Eco was great on this stuff too. These writers are playing with this tradition, but the Knights Templar were real. They were a Catholic Gnostic military group that emerged in part as a way of sort of protecting crusaders or basically people engaged in pilgrimages from Europe to Jerusalem and back again. It was a dangerous sort of trek to make, and some people think the Knights Templar were originally created to form these kind of militia that would help people make this move during what is essentially like a crusading period. It was thought that the Knights Templar, even though they were Catholic, that they had all kinds of influence from the Arabic world, from the Muslim traditions and the pagan traditions, and that they had a kind of weird, almost Gnostic view of Christianity that was mixed in with all these other traditions. And it was believed by some that they took a kind of vow of allegiance in a initiation rite involving Baphomet sculpture of some kind. That might have been a blood sacrifice of some kind. We don't know. There's a lot of speculation about this. But in any case, the Knights Templar, even though they were created by the Pope, became so powerful and strong that they were also disbanded by a subsequent Pope as being too dangerous and too threatening to mainstream Catholicism. Then Eliphas Levi, as I pointed out to you before, was an occultist, and Levi's Baphomet has become the standard image of the devil card in tarot. Then if you move forward to the 20th century, a name that's familiar to, all Led Zeppelin fans, Aleister Crowley, 1875 to 1947. He saw Baphomet as a liberating androgyne, a bisexual unity of opposites. And this was thought to be very liberating for people. We think Crowley was himself bisexual, and the belief was that, not unfounded, was that things like Christianity had legislated a very narrow format for things like sexual fulfillment. And as a result of this, people who had alternative interests, sexual orientations, or even if they themselves were trans in the modern sense, they would have had very little recourse in what is essentially a kind of buttoned up, conservative sexual morality of mainstream religion. And so if you can't get any acknowledgement, power, validation, and in fact, if all you get is hostility from the mainstream set of symbols and pathways through life, then the alternatives become very attractive to you. So it's very common for the imagery of Satanism then to be attractive because it's a way to get power that is in direct opposition to mainstream power symbols. You see this a little bit, for example, in the way in which, if you look at the development of blues culture in African American history, it's very common. If you can't, after slavery, you have the rise of the Jim Crow period. And if you're black in America, you might be free, but you are still denied access to many of the pathways to power that whites have. It's still a white supremacy culture during the sort of period of Jim Crow. And so as a result, you see in part some of the great blues artists like Robert Johnson gravitating to devil imagery. And so his songs are filled with, I went down to the crossroads and made a deal with the devil. And so you basically can't get validation in the church, so why not take it in this life? And the idea is that you've got, in a sense, a contest between value systems, and those value systems have their own iconography. So too, the magic tradition is connected to this. The deal with the devil is a very old tradition. Robert Johnson is a recent version of it, but of course, the idea of Faust, you think about Dr. Faustus. Let's go back, in history. Thomas Mann writes about Dr. Faust as a kind of musical deal with the devil as well, but a kind of Faustian bargain where you might have greater creativity, but it's a break from what I would sort of call bourgeoisie culture. You go back further and you find Goethe, the great German poet, writer, scientist, who writes 2 novels about Faust. Faust there is actually making a deal with Mephistopheles to do the kind of things we're talking about here, alchemy. Can I turn base metals into gold? Also, one of the great, projects of alchemy is to try to create a little homunculus, which is a little person. So the alchemists, and this occurs in Goethe's Faust, try to make a little Frankenstein. And Mary Shelley, we think, and the traditions of Frankenstein are continuations of this much older alchemy tradition of trying to make life from non-life ingredients. And you go back even to Marlowe's Faust. So the idea of interacting with a kind of a devil or Satan or pagan presence like Hermes Tresmegistus is, again, this alternative pathway of the hermetic or esoteric tradition. All right, I want to touch on a couple of other things here too, which is that if you look at the Renaissance, you start to get a change in what constitutes power. If you go back to the earlier period, you would have found the chivalry traditions of knights and maidens, and you would have found that masculine power would have been associated with military prowess, or, the more esoteric form would have been clerical, but they're basically increasingly detached from, procreation, sex. They're taking vows of celibacy. They're not having families. So there's a sense in which the tradition of having masculine power changes from the medieval to the Renaissance period from physical prowess to a kind of cultural prowess. That you get the rise of the virtuoso, somebody who knows a lot about society. So as you start to get the rise of a middle class with the development of Renaissance capitalism, trade, a merchant class, you start to get the rise of people who have sway and power, not just because they have money, but also because they have knowledge. So knowledge is power, and a lot of that knowledge is connected to the arts and culture and the budding sciences. You think about Da Vinci, for example. Here's a great image. I think this painting is I think this is a Hans Holbein painting, but don't hold me to it, of courtiers, ambassadors, and cultural refinement. On the left, you see this image. It's just a great image of these rich guys, dressed very elegantly, but look at they're surrounded by this cultural accoutrement of like knowledge and wisdom and music and the symbols of travel. These guys are worldly, right? And then if you look at the bottom there, you won't be able to perhaps see this, but there's a strange shape on the bottom. And in that image, you'll find actually a coded secret symbol, because you can only see it from a very specific angle, and then what slowly emerges is that it's a skull. It's a human skull painted there but stretched out so that you can't make it out unless you know the secret to decoding this painting. And so too, this kind of way of thinking about imagery as coded and nature as coded is also clearly envisaged in this image on the right of alchemy and the Gnostic traditions. There again, you see those interconnections. So the Renaissance man was basically someone who could learn and master all of this, or have some sense of these interconnections, and that made him quite powerful. All right. Here, again, I'm just stating the point I made before, but I love this image on the right, an alchemical distillation of fluids and minds. This guy seems to have his head stuck into a kind of steamer, and what I love about it is that it looks like it's basically like, I don't know if it's purging the bad psychology out of him or it's putting the good psychology into him, but in any case, there's some kind of transformation here of his psychology through alchemical means. And so generally, if you look here at the list on the left, just to codify these comments I've been making, you want to purify and perfect certain substances, including the transformation of base metals to gold. You want to create an elixir of immortality. So this was very common to think that you could find, the elixir of life and live forever. And you want to create these living homunculi. These were the sort of main three themes. Now, the way to do this, it was thought, was using what's something called the philosopher's stone. Lapis philosophorum was a mythical object that would assist in the above processes. So it was thought that there would be some object that would be like a magical stone, and you could, by rubbing things on it, passing things over it, using the right incantations, you could do the transformations that we're describing here. There doesn't appear to be any such thing, but it was believed that it was out there and people were searching for it. Of course, if there was such a thing and I knew about it, I couldn't tell you, because that would be a violation of the secret society. They'd have to kill me. All right, the Magi are the magicians then. And of course, we think of magic as, basically card tricks and so forth, but it's part of this very long history where the belief was that you really could change nature, not just by sleight of hand or sort of tricking or distracting the eye, but you could really transform it. And now comes a very interesting philosophical idea. Here, the idea is really comes from this Latin phrase, ex nihilo nihil fit, which means out of nothing, nothing comes. And this is an ancient stricture that means you can't get something from nothing. If something doesn't exist, it's even hard to express this. If you have something pop into existence that wasn't there before, the belief from the ancients all the way to the present is, well, it has some cause. And that cause, if you can't find it or detect it, must be God. In fact, the only thing that can make something from nothing would be God. Every other transformation or thing that appears to arise in nature is actually from something else. So change in nature is always a transformation of a pre-existing entity or reality. It's not the popping into existence of something that wasn't there before. The only thing that can do that, the belief is God, because that's a power that is not even really thinkable. And so the idea here was that magic accesses the immaterial sparks or ideal essences, aspects or reflections of the one, and it manipulates them to create novel results. So the idea here is that what the magician is doing is it's going into nature. It's finding within nature these little seeds of reality, which are hidden, and then it's manipulating those little seeds of reality to make a new reality. So it's a kind of strangely mystical chemistry. And let's look then at the physics of magic. The idea here is that you are not creating something new if you're a magician. You're actualizing potentiality that's already hidden within nature. So if we look at the history of this idea, it goes back to there's a Stoic idea called the logoi spermatikoi, which means there are sort of little logical seeds within every object. Let's say it's a rock, or it's a body of water, or an acorn. In fact, the acorn is kind of a good example, because the idea was that you look at an acorn and you don't see anything like an oak tree. So in a way, if you think about the acorn, it's kind of a good example to get clear on this. If you looked at an acorn, it does not seem to contain an oak tree within it, and yet if you plant it correctly, sure enough, acorns become oak trees. And the ancient belief was, well, there must be some kind of logoi spermatikoi, seeds, logical seeds, something we would call information. Of course, we now know about DNA, but this is almost like the ancient form of DNA, that within everything is some kind of code, and if you could get in there, get access to this code and manipulate it, you could manipulate nature in these dramatic ways. So that was the sort of physics of magic. That was the goal of actualizing this potential. Now it's a little weirder still, because the belief is not only is there the formula or logoi spermatikoi of the oak tree within the acorn, but the formula for everything else in the universe is also in the acorn. This is kind of an extreme view, but basically everything is in everything else. It's just in it as a kind of potentiality. And again, if you could go in there and manipulate it, you could actualize that potential. So that was the ultimate sort of philosophy or metaphysics underneath magic or hermeticism. And Plotinus continues this theory into the 3rd century AD. He's got his own version of it, but it's essentially sort of mixing it together with a kind of Neoplatonic view of the world. There is a version of this, actually, if you think about the beginning of the Bible and you think about the Abrahamic tradition too. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. Logos is also a similar notion in the sense that there's some kind of logic or grammar that underlies the dumb, raw, physical stuff of the universe and gives it form and shape and development. There's an idea like this in Hinduism too, where if you look at the ultimate sort of chant of Om, you'll find that the belief was that within Om was contained every other sound, and therefore it was sort of an allegory of the creative energy and potential of the divine, and that when you meditate and chant this over and over again, you are also sort of recreating or actualizing this potential. So in any case, this idea then I'm suggesting is there in other formats. But in terms of Western Hermetic tradition, we need to notice that St. Augustine, 354 to 430 AD, continues this notion, calling it rationes seminales, which is basically just the Latin translation of logos spermatikoi. So these rationes seminales are in everything, and again, what's happening is that transformation is just the actualizing of this, rather than something being created de novo or out of nothing. And then in the Renaissance period, Marsilio Ficino reaffirms the seminales in the 1400s, and Ficino is an important character because he sort of gives us one of the greatest expressions of the Hermetic tradition, because if I'm not mistaken, he actually translates some of those early texts that we talked about coming out of the pagan tradition. All right. Other important figures just to note, we don't have time to go into this, but you may have heard of Paracelsus, 1495 to 1541, an alchemist, astrologer, physician. Quote, "That which lives on reason lives against the spirit." So he had a view of rationality as sort of like maybe how the Romantics saw rationality, that it kind of killed the animating dynamism of a sort of magical worldview. And it's kind of interesting that, maybe as a historic note, that in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, one of the things that Dr. Frankenstein is doing as he develops, his studies and creates, before he creates the creature, is he's gone off the chart, or off the map, so to speak, of the scientific education of the age, and he's gone into thinkers like Paracelsus, and he's doing things that are alchemical. It's not described in detail what he's up to, but instead of reading the science of the day, which I suppose, if we're talking about 1800, and the characters are couched in the 1700s, he would have been supposedly should have been reading stuff from the scientific revolution. Frankenstein's going back and looking at these alchemists like Paracelsus, and it's only that knowledge that allows him, he says, to create the creature. So again, it's kind of a nice pop culture, well, not even pop culture, because Frankenstein, at least as a novel, is still considered of the arguably of the high literary tradition. In any case, Athanasius Kircher is probably a name you're not familiar with, but if you want to see the most interesting man in the world, that's the guy. Kircher had his hand into everything and was just an incredible polymath and very influential in the Renaissance. The idea of these thinkers is that, again, that Hermetica is a universal knowledge. So they saw it as unifying pagan and Abrahamic traditions. They saw it as taking the best of both worlds. They also saw it as unifying Egyptian culture and Abrahamic. So again, I'm sort of just re-articulating the ecumenical nature. And pictorial rather than propositional. Here's something of interest to us. The Rosicrucians are an early 17th century secret society, and they give us a wonderful expression, articulation of some of these themes we've been talking about. In his work, Silentium Post Clamores, in 1617, the Rosicrucian Michel Maire described Rosicrucianism as having arisen from a, quote, primordial tradition, saying, quote, "Our origins are Egyptian, Brahmanic, derived from the mysteries of Eleusis and Samothrace, the Magi of Persia, the Pythagoreans, and the Arabs. So there's just a wonderful, clear statement of all of the sources that they're drawing upon and mixing together. And here's some imagery from the Rosicrucians you see here on the right-hand side. You've got, again, the pelican feeding its young. That's the Christian reference. You've got the Christian cross and the rose, sometimes symbolizing Mary. You've got sort of measuring symbols of masonry here mixed in. They influenced subsequent secret societies like Freemasonry and then Theosophy. And in Elias Ashmole's Theatrum Chemicum Britannicum from 1650, he defends the Rosicrucians. And I bring this up because Elias Ashmole is, his dates here you can see are 1617 to 1692, very influential in the development of collecting, museums, and the rise of sciences in Europe. And it's just very interesting to see that he himself seems to have been tied in with these secret societies. You can go now and see the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England. Many of his early collections were ways to take natural objects and artificial objects and try to celebrate what their symbolic or deeper metaphysical meaning might be. And he would gather these together as a curiosity cabinet, what the Germans called a Wunderkammern, wonder cabinet. And these then, after Ashmole's death, this stuff ended up in creating basically the seed collection of the British Museum, and a lot of it is still at the Ashmolean in Oxford. But this stuff had a huge influence on the rise of science generally, because empirical science needed access to specimens. And so it slowly began to emerge that the natural sciences started to detach from these more magical approaches and look rather at the mechanics or the efficient causation of nature itself. All right, collection then itself was a kind of microcosm, and that showed the power of creation. And so it was very common for the collection is both new experimentalism and also old Gnostic tradition mixed together. Both together give knowledge, and as Francis Bacon says, knowledge is power. So I love this imagery here on the left. You've got God creating the universe as a craftsman. This is sort of the first cause creator. And then on the right, you've got a very famous etching in which you've got a scientist / alchemist penetrating and reaching out, sticking his head out through the physical or seen world of phenomenon and appearance to see the hidden, machinery of behind things. And so, as I said before, alchemy really does give way to chemistry in many ways, and treating the body symbolically in this kind of magical way slowly develops our thinking through the kind of thinking of the body as being made up of four humors and as a kind of balance. Eventually you start looking more closely through anatomy and physiology. You look at somebody like William Harvey, who's actually dissecting bodies. Even Rene Descartes is dissecting bodies. We're slowly beginning to see, the body's more than just a symbol system. It's actually got this machinery in it, and it gave rise to a much better sense of physiology and what we think of as modern science. Here's a wonderful artist and anatomist and biologist of the modern period, Frederick Reusch, 1638 to 1731. And I'm not going to spend much time on this, but I wanted you to sort of look. Here's a great painting of Reusch in the upper right doing an anatomy lesson on a baby here, and this sort of gentleman class of virtuosos of the day are learning anatomy. And actually it's sort of interesting that boy on the right-hand side there holding a skeleton is actually a depiction of Reusch's son. But if you look on the left-hand side, you see this incredible black and white etching, and this is an etching of the kind of dioramas that Frederick Reusch would make. He was a phenomenal anatomist and scientist, but he would also take body parts and make these artistic representations. So he had the skeletons of babies and children who had died, and he would pose them in these strange macabre dioramas. If you look closely, there's sort of these built-up rocks and what look like geological formations, but those are actually kidney stones and various tumors from the body. And you see even like sort of dried arteries created there. And it's just a great example to see that what's happening here is that science as we know it is starting to emerge out of this more symbolic view of nature. But Reusch has got a foot in both camps. He's anatomizing the body and learning how it really works, but on the other hand, he's making these diorama to remind us that the flesh is impermanent. Memento mori, remember your death. Get on the straight path and be more spiritually sophisticated because we're all going to die. So there's a sense in which it's just a wonderful time in which you see the sort of enchanted and disenchanted world of nature together. What's starting to happen then are the classification systems of science like Isaac Newton classifying the laws of nature, Carl Linnaeus classifying, giving us a binomial nomenclature and the system and causes of nature, and this is happening in the 16 and the 1700s. And then you get to what we consider our own era, and this is basically what's sometimes characterized as the disenchanted world. As Max Weber, a very famous sociologist, said, the fate of our times is characterized by the rationalization and intellectualization, and above all, by the disenchantment of the world. And you see that, in fact, bodies are more like sophisticated machines, and that we evolved from simpler organisms. And this is certainly true. We know that evolution is how the world really works. We know that we are physical systems and that the brain is a large part of who we are. But you can see how disenchanting and it would be to the person who's spiritually or magically minded. And the way in which we look at the 20th century rise of secularism, it's basically saying that all of this magical thinking and spiritualism go together, and the truly skeptical scientific mind wants to sort of consign all that magic and religion to the fire. Just throw those books and those ideas on the fire because they're not really helping us understand nature. And in fact, they're keeping us down by confusing us with dogma and strange miracles that don't really occur. So, and there's good reason for that hostility. Obviously, one only needs to point to the witch trials, Salem witch trials, and the pursuit of witches in the form of, Heinrich Institutorus writes the Malleus Maleficarum, which is a sort of witch hunting guide, which Europeans use to persecute all kinds of people. So it's pretty clear to see how magical thinking has a terrible dark side, and I'm not defending it by any means. But you can see that the pendulum has swung towards the sciences in the 20th century and away from this magical thinking in terms of elite knowledge. I think in terms of the masses and the larger population, we're just as magical as we ever were. Quick comment here, perhaps, about the interesting tension and incomplete separation of science and magic by pointing to people like William James, or one thinks, for example, of Arthur Conan Doyle, who, even while he creates the most rational hero of logic and deductive and inductive reasoning in Sherlock Holmes, he's also at the same time going to seances and believing in fairies and very much deeply involved in magical thinking. So again, that separation is not, perhaps it's never entirely complete, and I just find it fascinating that when it isn't entirely complete. And William James, again, also a very rational psychologist and philosopher of the late 19th, early 20th century, was hostile to many traditional forms of magic, and yet in 1885, the year after the death of his young son, William James had his first sitting with a seance medium, and he became convinced that mediums might not be talking to the dead, but rather telepathically gleaning facts from the bereaved person's mind. Now, it's kind of humorous in a way that he doesn't think that the medium is talking to the dead, but in fact thinks that the medium is reading your mind and getting information about the dead from your own mind. All of this is clearly not in the realm of science and more in the realm of wishful thinking. But notice that it's tied to the death of his young son. When are we most vulnerable? When are we most attracted to magical thinking? It's in these cases when we've lost a loved one, or we ourselves are sick and dying, or it's in misery tends to activate the sort of enchanted mind or the magical mind. And this is not, I'm not denigrating, I've been there, so I'm not on a sort of pulpit here looking down my nose at it, I'm simply noticing it. And then I've brought in now, maybe I'm sort of thinking about a late 20th century, a more contemporary, 21st century contemporary way of finding rapprochement between the magical and the secular worlds. And, I've talked about Georginus before, who was looking at, as a painter, was looking at nature as a kind of conduit to the spiritual. And he says, well, the artist is a pilgrim trying to reveal the reality of the unseen. And another wonderful quote by him is that the true use of art is first to cultivate the artist's own spiritual nature, and second, to enter as a factor in general civilization. And these just strike me as wonderful ways to try to think about nature as enchanted without all of the kind of magical metaphysics. You don't need to sort of say, well, there's a rationis seminalis, or, seeds of everything in everything else. I don't think that one necessarily has to move in that direction. There have been other ways in which to sort of update alchemy for the 20th and 21st century. One thinks, for example, of the work by Carl Jung, who basically tried to do a psychologizing of alchemy. I leave it to you to assess whether he's effective, but Jung suggested that the common imagery that you find in alchemy is not an expression of, reaching these ultimate realities, in astrology, but rather it's a reflection of the common archetypes or psychological patterns within human beings. So the way you see things like the dragon or the black sun or the hermaphrodite or the salamander, the kind of imagery we saw before, the lobster, you see these kinds of things in the images of alchemy. And he says, well, they're repeated in contemporary human dreams too. So if you, as a psychoanalyst, he would talk to people about their dreams, and sure enough, they would have some of these images in their dreams. And he thought that this reveals that the collective unconscious, instincts and archetypes, is our underlying psychological reality. And so he thinks what was happening in traditional alchemy was when they would keep having visions or similar ideas about magical images, he says he thought they were projecting their own minds onto nature. And this he thought was the way to really understand alchemy. And he thinks this is alive and well. We can still be alchemists of the mind, just we're not really trying to turn base metals into gold. We're trying to take the internal deep elements and make them explicit to ourselves and others, and then work on them for greater psychological health. And lastly, one more way of thinking about re-enchanting the world, which is thinking about the transcendent psyche, a sort of secular spiritualism. So here you might think about the world as enchanted, but not because it's filled with magical, animistic spirits or God is everywhere in it, but there might just be spiritual ways of seeing. If you look down here on my list, here on the left, you could think there are spiritual ways of seeing, spiritual ways of doing, spiritual ways of relating to others, and spiritual ways of knowing. And this might get you a way to think about a re-enchanted world that isn't just sort of mechanical machinery of organisms pitted against each other in a Darwinian survival of the fittest, but you might be able to sort of see the world as having a higher dimension that you could realize in your own ways of doing and relating to people, and you don't need all the metaphysical baggage on top of it. This is why I'm just ending the talk here as a way of thinking about what are the elements of hermetic or esoteric thinking that have survived and that could go forward, and that's why I'm sort of landing in this particular place. All right, that's enough for now. That's a lot to take in, and give some thought to that, do further research, and I'll see you next time.